Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. The date is May 28, 1453. Outside the ancient walls of Constantinople, a 21-year-old sultan stares into the flickering torchlight, the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He is Mehmed, son of Murad, and tomorrow he will either be the conqueror of the world's most impenetrable city or a failure consigned to the footnotes of history. This is the story of that night, the prayers, the fears, and the iron will of the man who would redraw the map of the world and earn the name Fatih, the Conqueror. In the gilded cages of the Ottoman court, a prince was not merely born, he was forged in a crucible of suspicion and rivalry. For the young Mehmed, son of Sultan Murad II, this reality was a cold, daily truth. Born in 1432, he was not the heir apparent. That honor belonged to his older favoured half-brother, Shehzade Ahmed. While Ahmed was groomed for the throne in the capital, Mehmed was sent to the provincial governorship of Amasya at the tender age of 6, a gilded exile designed to teach him the arts of war and governance, but also to keep him far from the centre of power. He was a contingency, a spare part in the imperial machine. This distance bred a unique kind of man. While other princes learned courtly intrigue, Mehmed learned solitude. He devoured books on history, science, and military strategy, becoming fluent in multiple languages. His tutors spoke of a boy with a fearsome intellect and a chilling intensity, a quiet observer who missed nothing. The shadows of the palace were his classroom, teaching him that power was not given, but seized. Then, fate intervened with brutal finality. In 1443, the golden heir, Ahmed, died suddenly. The throne's path was now clear, but the lesson of fragility was seared into Mehmed's mind. Power was fleeting, and life even more so. The court's whispers turned to him, this serious, scholarly boy who had spent his life on the periphery. But his ascension was not yet assured. Another infant brother, also named Ahmed, was born to one of his father's wives, a potential new rival. The young prince learned early that the greatest threat to an Ottoman prince was often found in his own cradle, sharing his own blood. It was a lesson in paranoia and preemption he would never forget. In 1444, an event occurred that should have been the culmination of a prince's ambition. Sultan Murad II, weary of war and grieving his son's death, abdicated, handing the formidable Ottoman throne to 12-year-old Mehmed. It was a staggering transfer of power, but it was a crown made of glass. The boy sultan was immediately surrounded by vultures. The veteran Grand Vizier, Çandarlı Halil Pasha, who had served his father faithfully, saw not a master, but a puppet. He and the old guard of the court deeply distrusted Mehmed's aggressive ambitions and his circle of reformist tutors. They paid lip service to his authority while working tirelessly to undermine it. The empire's enemies saw weakness. A massive crusader army, sensing opportunity, broke a recent peace treaty and marched into Ottoman lands. Panic gripped the capital. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the Sultan, grew restless, openly mocking the young ruler and demanding more pay. Mehmed, full of theoretical knowledge from his books, found himself powerless against the tide of real-world politics and betrayal. He ordered his father's vizier to lead the army, but the court was paralyzed by infighting. In a moment of desperate, humiliating clarity, the boy sultan was forced to send a message to his retired father. "If you are the sultan, come and lead your armies. If I am the sultan, I order you to come and lead my armies." Murad returned, crushed the crusaders at the Battle of Varna, and quietly, but firmly, retook the throne. Mehmed was sent away once more, his first reign a catastrophic failure after just 2 years. The experience was not just a political defeat, it was a profound personal humiliation. The sting of being deemed inadequate, of having his power revealed as a hollow charade, would burn within him, fueling a relentless, lifelong resolve to never be controlled by anyone ever again. To understand the soul of an Ottoman sultan, one must first understand the chilling logic of the silk cord. For centuries, the succession was a bloody free-for-all. Upon a sultan's death, his sons would race to the capital, and the one who secured the throne would hunt down and execute his brothers to prevent the inevitable civil wars that had torn the empire apart in its early days. This wasn't mere cruelty. It was a brutal political calculus known as the law of fratricide. The stability of the state was deemed more sacred than the life of a prince. For Mehmed, this was not an abstract theory. He had seen his elder brother die, clearing his path. He had witnessed the birth of a new infant brother, a potential future threat. When his father, Murad II, died for the second and final time in 1451, Mehmed returned to the throne at the age of 19. He was no longer the boy who had been pushed aside. He was a man forged in failure and hardened by ambition. His first significant act as sultan was a grim testament to this transformation. He summoned his infant half-brother, Ahmed, who was still nursing at his mother's breast. As the mother pleaded, an executioner was sent in. The child was drowned in his bath, a death considered more dignified than shedding royal blood. There was no hesitation, no public mourning. There was only the cold, silent logic of power. Mehmed had eliminated the last potential claimant to his throne, the last seed of a future civil war. But he went further. He did not simply practice the tradition, he codified it. He formally inscribed the law of fratricide into his legal code, the Canonime, stating, "For the welfare of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the sultanate may lawfully put his brothers to death." He transformed a gruesome custom into the explicit law of the land, ensuring that the silk cord, not sentiment, would secure the future of his dynasty. With his domestic rivals eliminated and the throne secured by blood and law, Mehmed's gaze turned outward, fixating on a single point on the map, an obsession that had haunted him since childhood: Constantinople. For the Turks, the city was more than a strategic prize. It was the Kızıl Elma, the red apple, a potent, semi-mystical symbol of ultimate conquest, the prophesied destiny of a great Islamic warrior. For Mehmed, this was not just a myth. It was his personal calling, the one act that could erase the humiliation of his first failed reign and cement his name in history for eternity. He saw himself as the man foretold in the Hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad: "Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will he be, and what a wonderful army will that army be." This belief drove him with a messianic fervor. He consumed every text he could find on the city's history, its defenses, its legendary sieges. He sketched its fortifications from memory, studying the weak points in the 1,000-year-old Theodosian walls. His obsession went beyond mere strategy. It was an intellectual and spiritual quest. He gathered architects, engineers, and scholars, most notably the Hungarian cannon founder Orban, tasking them with a singular purpose: to build siege weapons of a scale the world had never seen, cannons capable of shattering the walls that had repelled every conqueror for a millennium. The old guard, led by the cautious Halil Pasha, urged diplomacy and restraint. They saw the Byzantine capital as a decaying but still formidable fortress, a fool's errand that could bankrupt the empire and invite another crusade. But Mehmed silenced them with cold fury. He was not his father. He would not be swayed by cautious old men. The red apple was ripe for the picking, and he believed God and history had chosen him to be the one to pluck it. In the spring of 1452, a year before the Great Siege, a shadow began to stretch across the Bosphorus. It was a shadow of stone and intent, personally cast by the young Sultan himself. On the European shore, directly opposite the older Anatolian fortress built by his great-grandfather, Mehmed began the construction of a citadel that would be both a strategic masterpiece and a terrifying psychological weapon. He called it Rumeli Hisara, but it would earn a more visceral name: Boğazkeser, the throat cutter. This was not a slow, methodical project. It was a blitzkrieg of engineering, fueled by Mehmed's obsessive impatience. He was there on the ground, a whirlwind of energy, personally directing the placement of its 3 great towers, each named for the vizier responsible for its completion. Over 1,000 master masons and twice as many laborers worked day and night, their torches burning like a new constellation in the Byzantine sky. The Emperor Constantine XI watched from his palace, sending envoys to protest this blatant violation of treaties. Mehmed's reply was chillingly direct. "I may do whatever I wish. The shores of the Bosphorus belong to me, those on the Asian side because they are inhabited by Ottomans, and those on the European side because you are not strong enough to defend them." The fortress rose with unnatural speed, completed in just over 4 months. Its design was a statement of power, its towers and walls allegedly forming the Kufic script for the name Muhammad. Its purpose was absolute, to sever Constantinople's final maritime link to the Black Sea, cutting off grain supplies and any potential aid from Genoese colonies. The first test came quickly. A Venetian vessel, refusing to lower its sails and pay the new toll, was summarily obliterated by a cannonball from the fortress walls. The crew was captured and its captain impaled. The message was unmistakable. The throat cutter was not a deterrent. It was a noose, and Mehmed's hand was slowly, inexorably, beginning to pull it tight. History is often turned by the ambition of a single man. In this case, it was a man of metal and fire, a Hungarian cannon founder named Urban. He was a master of a dark new art, harnessing the explosive power of gunpowder. Initially, Urban offered his deadly skills to the man who needed them most, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI. He promised cannons that could shatter the walls of any city. But the once great empire was a hollow shell, its treasury empty. Constantine could offer Urban only a meagre salary, not the vast resources his vision required. Scorned and unpaid, Urban took his talents elsewhere. He travelled to Adrianople, to the court of the one man in the world whose ambition matched his own, Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed did not haggle. He did not count the cost. He asked Urban a single defining question. Could he cast a cannon large enough to breach the legendary Theodosian walls, a fortification that had stood unvanquished for 1,000 years? Urban, seeing a patron who understood the scale of his genius, promised he could. The Sultan gave him unlimited funds, materials, and manpower. For 3 months, in the foundries of Adrianople, Urban and his army of assistants toiled. They created a weapon of terrifying proportions, a bronze behemoth unlike any the world had ever seen. It was over 27 feet long, with a barrel so wide a man could crawl inside. It was designed to hurl a stone ball weighing over 1/2 a ton more than a mile. When it was test-fired, the sound was said to have shattered the heavens, the concussion shaking the ground for miles. This was more than a cannon. It was a monster, a physical manifestation of Mehmed's will. And now, it began its slow, ponderous journey towards Constantinople, dragged by 60 oxen and supported by hundreds of men, a creeping agent of doom inching its way towards the city of God. While Urban's monster crept across the Thracian plains, the full might of the Ottoman Empire was converging on the same target. This was not merely an army, it was a force of nature, a human flood drawn from every corner of Mehmed's rapidly expanding domains. The numbers alone were staggering, a testament to the Sultan's logistical genius and absolute power. Conservative estimates place the force at over 80,000 fighting men, while some contemporary accounts swell to more than 200,000. At its core were the Janissaries, the heart of the Ottoman war machine. Numbering around 12,000, these were the elite, the Sultan's personal slave soldiers, raised from youth for war and war alone. Armed with arquebuses, bows and scimitars, their discipline was legendary, their loyalty to the Sultan absolute. They were the scalpel. Surrounding them were the tens of thousands of provincial troops, the Anatolian and Rumelian Sipahis, feudal cavalry bound by duty and the promise of land. And then there were the irregulars, the wild and terrifying Bashi bazooks. Drawn by the promise of unlimited plunder, they were a chaotic, ferocious vanguard, sent to exhaust the defenders before the main assault. But Mehmed's army was not just about brute force. It was a modern, combined arms military. He brought thousands of engineers, miners, and sappers, tasked with digging beneath the great walls. He assembled a massive fleet of over 100 ships to blockade the city from the sea. And accompanying them all were the spiritual motivators, the imams and dervishes who walked among the troops, reciting verses from the Quran, reminding them of the Prophet's ancient desire to conquer the city and promising the eternal glories of paradise to those who fell as martyrs. As this vast, multicultural, and fanatically motivated host settled into its siege lines before the Theodosian walls, it must have seemed to the handful of defenders on the ramparts that the entire world had come to claim their city. Inside the doomed city, another sovereign wrestled with fate. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the 12th and final Roman emperor to bear that name, was a man standing against the tide of history. He was a brave soldier and a pragmatic ruler, but he had inherited a crown of thorns, the leadership of an empire that was now little more than a city-state, a ghost haunting its own magnificent walls. His every waking moment was consumed by a single desperate task: finding help. He sent frantic appeals across the Christian world, to the Pope in Rome, to the merchants of Venice and Genoa, to the kingdoms of Europe. Help was offered, but at a terrible price. For centuries, a great schism had divided the Orthodox East from the Catholic West. The Pope demanded that for Western swords to defend Constantinople, the Orthodox Church must submit to papal authority. For Constantine, it was an impossible choice: sacrifice his city's soul to save its body. He agreed. In the hallowed sanctuary of the Hagia Sophia, a union of the churches was formally declared. But instead of uniting his people, it fractured them. A powerful faction, led by the high-ranking noble Lucas Notarus, was enraged. Notarus famously declared, "I would rather see the Sultan's turban in the midst of the city than the Latin mitre." The people rioted, shunning their own great cathedral, now seeing it as defiled. While Mehmed's army was united by a singular, divine purpose, Constantine's city was tearing itself apart with theological hatred. In the end, the promised crusade from the west never materialized. Only a few hundred brave souls came, most notably the brilliant Genoese soldier of fortune, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who brought 700 men. With these, and his own garrison of barely 5,000 Byzantines, Constantine prepared to defend 14 miles of walls against an army more than 20 times its size. It was not a strategy for victory, it was a gamble for honor, a final defiant stand for 1,000 years of Christian Rome. For weeks, the war had been one of attrition and thunder. Mehmed's superguns, the likes of which the world had never seen, hammered the ancient Theodosian walls, reducing sections to rubble. Yet, the city endured. The defenders, a mix of determined Byzantines and hardened Genoese mercenaries, worked tirelessly under the cover of night, repairing the breaches with earth and wood. They were bleeding, exhausted, but unbroken. Their true confidence, however, lay not in their walls of stone, but in a wall of iron floating on water. Across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the city's vital natural harbour, stretched a colossal chain. Forged of massive iron links, it was buoyed by wooden logs and anchored to towers on both shores, one in the suburb of Galata, the other near the Acropolis. This was the legendary Golden Chain, the gatekeeper of Constantinople's naval heart. Behind it, the small but capable Byzantine and Italian fleet rested securely, a dagger aimed at the flank of any force that breached the land walls. For Mehmed, this chain was more than an obstacle. It was a personal insult. It rendered his mighty navy, a fleet of over 100 ships, utterly useless. He had watched with mounting fury as his admiral, Baltaolu Suleiman, had attempted to force the boom. The engagement was a disaster. The taller, more heavily armed Byzantine ships, aided by the treacherous currents, had repelled the Ottoman galleys with a storm of projectiles and Greek fire. Several Ottoman ships were burned to their waterlines, their crews perishing in the inferno. The defeat was a public humiliation for the young sultan. His commanders whispered, his soldiers doubted. the chain held. It was a symbol of the city's defiance, a physical manifestation of its stubborn will to exist. Every morning, Mehmed would ride to a hilltop and stare at it, a dark obsession taking root in his mind. The walls could be pounded to dust, but as long as that chain held, the city could be resupplied by sea. As long as the Golden Horn was a sanctuary, the war was a stalemate. The problem consumed him. It was an impossible knot, a riddle of geography and steel. And for a man who believed himself destined to conquer the world, impossible was not a word he was willing to accept. The mind of a genius, when cornered, does not see walls, it sees pathways. Frustrated by the sea, Mehmed II turned his gaze to the land. To his north lay the steep hills of Galata, a Genoese colony that remained nervously neutral. An idea, born of desperation and breathtaking ambition, began to form in his mind. It was a plan so audacious, so utterly outside the known principles of warfare, that it bordered on madness. If he could not sail his fleet through the chain, he would sail it around it, over land. The project began in absolute secrecy, under the cover of darkness. Thousands of Mehmed's most loyal soldiers and engineers were put to the task. They were not told the grand design, only their immediate duty. An army of woodcutters felled thousands of trees from the forests behind the camp. Carpenters and labourers worked feverishly, constructing a massive wooden road, a slipway nearly 2 kilometres long, stretching from the shores of the Bosphorus, up and over the steep hill of Galata, and down into the protected waters of the Golden Horn. The road was laid with heavy timber planks, which were then coated with an enormous quantity of animal fat and oil. It was a greasy, makeshift highway designed for a purpose no one could yet fathom. Then came the night of April 22nd. Under a sliver of moon, the Herculean effort began. Teams of oxen, yoked together in immense spans, were hitched to the Ottoman galleys. Thousands of soldiers, pushing from behind and guiding from the sides, began to haul the ships out of the water and onto the greased slipway. With sails unfurled to catch the night breeze, the vessels began their surreal journey. The sound of creaking timbers, the straining of ropes, the lowing of oxen, and the grunts of thousands of men were masked by a continuous, thunderous cannonade against the land walls, a deliberate diversion to distract the city's exhausted defenders. As dawn broke, the Byzantines awoke to a sight that shattered their reality. The Ottoman fleet, a forest of masts and crescent flags, was not outside the harbour. It was inside. 70 ships now sat upon the calm waters of the Golden Horn, behind their unbreakable chain. It was a miracle of logistics, an act of sheer, indomitable will. For the defenders of Constantinople, it was the stuff of nightmares, a psychological blow from which they would never recover. May 28, 1453. A hush fell over the world. For 52 days, the air had been thick with the dust of shattered walls and the unending roar of cannons. Now, an eerie silence descended. Inside the Ottoman camp, it was a silence born of anticipation, a coiled spring of immense energy. Mehmed II, now only 21 years old, rode through the ranks of his army. His face was a mask of grim resolve. He gathered his commanders, his pashas and beys, and the aegis of his janissaries. His voice, clear and cold, cut through the twilight air. He spoke not of doubt, but of destiny. He reminded them of the prophet's promise, of the glory that awaited the conqueror of this fabled city. He promised them wealth beyond their wildest imaginings, 3 days of unrestricted plunder. He promised them honor that would echo through the ages, and he promised death to any man who faltered. As night fell, the entire Ottoman camp became a sea of light. Every tent was illuminated, and massive bonfires were lit, their flames leaping towards the heavens. The sounds of prayer and the rhythmic chanting of Allahu Akbar rolled across the fields like a rising tide, a terrifying, mesmerizing wave of sound meant to break the spirit of the men watching from the walls. Inside the city, the silence was of a different kind. It was the silence of endings. Emperor Constantine XI. Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, knew the hour was at hand. There would be no miracle, no relieving fleet from the Christian West. He gathered what remained of his nobles and commanders. There were no grand promises, only a quiet appeal to honor, faith, and memory. He urged them to fight for their God, their homes, and the 1,000-year legacy they represented. Then, he led a solemn procession through the city's darkened streets to the Hagia Sophia. In the vast, cavernous space, under the sorrowful gaze of the golden mosaics, Orthodox and Catholic, Byzantine and Genoese, stood side by side. They put aside centuries of schism and distrust to share one final communion. It was a moment of profound, tragic unity. The emperor, stripped of his imperial regalia, stood as just a man, a soldier preparing to meet his fate. The city held its breath, suspended between a glorious past and a terrifying dawn. An hour after midnight, on Tuesday, May 29th, the silence was shattered. Not by a single cannon, but by a deafening, unified roar from 100,000 throats, accompanied by the thunder of drums and the piercing blare of trumpets. The final assault had begun. Mehmed's strategy was one of brutal, calculated exhaustion. He would throw waves of men at the walls until the defenders, already outnumbered and weary, simply collapsed. The first to charge were the Bashi bazouks, the irregulars. They were a motley collection of adventurers, zealots, and mercenaries from across the Ottoman world, armed with anything they could carry. They were promised plunder, but were ultimately expendable, sent forward to absorb the first volleys of arrows, stones, and Greek fire. They swarmed towards the weakest section of the walls in the Lycus Valley, their scaling ladders splintering against the ramparts. The defense was ferocious. Emperor Constantine, a sword in his hand, fought personally at the breach, a beacon of courage for his beleaguered men. Beside him stood the towering figure of the Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a brilliant soldier whose leadership had been the backbone of the entire defense. For 2 hours, the Bashi bazouks were thrown back, their bodies piling up in the city's moat. As they retreated in disarray, the second wave was unleashed. These were the Anatolian troops, disciplined and heavily armored, advancing in organized formations under the cover of a relentless artillery barrage. The fighting intensified, becoming a desperate hand-to-hand struggle on the broken ramparts. The air was a thick cocktail of smoke, sweat, and blood. Yet, the defenders held. Constantine and Giustiniani seemed to be everywhere at once, plugging gaps, rallying wavering soldiers, their armor dented and stained. They were performing a miracle of defiance. But Mehmed had anticipated this. He had held his finest troops, his ultimate weapon, in reserve. As the sun began to hint at its arrival, the final decisive blow was prepared. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite, unyielding slave soldiers, began their silent, disciplined advance. They did not shout or scream. They marched forward to the steady, unnerving beat of their drums, a relentless tide of white turbans and gleaming scimitars, aimed directly at the heart of the dying Roman Empire. The final hours were a symphony of iron and fear. For 53 days, the Theodosian walls, the stony guardians of a 1,000-year-old empire, had bled but had not broken. Now, on the 29th of May, 1453, they were about to fail. The air, thick with gunpowder and the salt of the Golden Horn, vibrated with the roar of Mehmed's great cannon and the relentless pounding of his Janissaries' drums. The final assault began before dawn, a human tide crashing against the ramparts. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, a Titan holding the line, was mortally wounded, and with his fall, the spirit of the defense began to fracture. It was then that a small, forgotten gate, the Kerka Porta, was breached. A simple gate, left unbolted, became the entry point of history. The crescent banner was raised on the walls. The cry of victory was drowned by the screams of the dying. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last of the Caesars, cast aside his imperial purple and charged into the fray, disappearing into the maelstrom of steel, a ghost emperor consumed by the birth of a new empire. From his command post, Mehmed watched the culmination of his obsession. There was no wild exultation, but a profound, almost terrifying sense of destiny fulfilled. He rode into the city not as a barbarian, but as a sovereign claiming his inheritance. He passed through streets slick with blood, past weeping survivors and the bodies of defenders. He made his way to the great palace of the emperors, now a hollow shell. Gazing upon its desolation, the 21-year-old Sultan, a man of letters as much as of war, was said to have recited a somber Persian couplet. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. The conquest was complete, but in that moment of ultimate triumph, Mehmed understood the crushing weight and heartbreaking transience of all worldly power. The conquest was an act of war. The claiming of the city was an act of theatre and statecraft. Mehmed's formal entry into Constantinople was a meticulously staged procession, designed to awe and intimidate. He rode his finest charger through the gate of Carisius, flanked by his viziers and generals, his janissaries clearing a path through the dazed and broken populace. His destination was not a palace, but a soul. He rode directly to the Hagia Sophia, the great church, the heart of Orthodox Christendom for 9 centuries. Dismounting, he paused at the bronze doors, a conqueror on the threshold of the sacred. Inside, the vast, light-filled space was packed with terrified citizens seeking sanctuary. As Mehmed stepped inside, a hush fell. He saw the shimmering gold mosaics, the celestial dome that seemed to float on air. In a gesture of profound symbolism, he bent down, took a handful of earth from the floor, and sprinkled it over his turban, an act of humility before God in his hour of greatest victory. He then ascended to the pulpit. The call to Islamic prayer, the adhan, echoed through the great church for the first time. The transformation was sealed. Constantinople had a new master and a new faith. In this single act, Mehmed declared himself more than a sultan. He adopted the title Kaiseri Rum, Caesar of Rome. He was the inheritor, not the destroyer. The city was the bridge, and he now controlled both sides. He was the lord of 2 lands, Europe and Asia, and the lord of 2 seas, the Aegean and the Black Sea. This was the foundation of a new world order. The young ruler, who had been underestimated by all of Christendom, had not just captured a city. He had seized the mantle of empire, positioning his Ottoman dynasty as the legitimate successor to the Romans, destined to rule from the world's most coveted throne. Victory is one thing, governance another. Mehmed had conquered a city of ghosts. Its population, once close to 1 million, had dwindled to perhaps 50,000. It was a hollow jewel, scarred by war and neglect. The Sultan understood that an empty capital was no capital at all. His vision was not of a Turkish garrison, but of a thriving cosmopolitan metropolis that would be the envy of the world. His first act was one of calculated mercy and ruthless pragmatism. He issued a proclamation guaranteeing the lives and property of any resident who had not fled. He invited the Orthodox Patriarch back to the city, granting him authority over the Greek Orthodox population, the beginning of the millet system, where religious communities governed their own affairs. This was not tolerance born of sentiment, but of necessity. He needed the skills of his new subjects. He then began a massive, often brutal program of resettlement. Decrees were sent across his empire, ordering families, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, Turks, Greeks, and Armenians, to move to the city. He wanted merchants from Bursa, artisans from Karaman, and scholars from everywhere. He offered them tax incentives and homes, but refusal was not an option. He was repopulating his capital by force of will. Simultaneously, he began to build. The ruins of the old Forum gave way to the sprawling labyrinth of the Grand Bazaar, a new heart for commerce. On the site of the ancient Acropolis, he laid the foundations for a new palace, Topkapı Sarayı, which would be the center of Ottoman power for 4 centuries. The city's name, too, began to change in common parlance. While officially Konstantiniyye, the Greek phrase eis tin polin, meaning to the city, was slowly Turkified into Istanbul. Mehmed the Conqueror was now becoming Mehmed the Builder, transforming the decaying Christian capital into the vibrant multicultural nerve center of a burgeoning Islamic empire. While Mehmed was transforming Constantinople into Istanbul, a shadow fell across his northern borders. In the rugged mountains of Wallachia, a vassal prince had grown tired of Ottoman dominion. This was no ordinary rebel. This was Vlad III, a man who had spent his youth as a political hostage at Mehmed's own court. He knew the Sultan. He knew his methods, his language, his psychology, and he was fueled by a singular, pathological hatred. Known to history as Vlad the Impaler, his rebellion was not a campaign of battles, but of terror. When Mehmed's envoys came to demand the overdue tribute, Vlad had their turbans nailed to their heads. He then crossed the frozen Danube, unleashing a storm of fire and death on Ottoman territory, massacring tens of thousands. Mehmed, enraged by the audacity and brutality of a man he considered his subordinate, gathered a colossal army, a force larger than the one that took Constantinople, and marched north to crush him. But Vlad refused to meet him in open battle. He waged a war of shadows, poisoning wells, orchestrating ambushes, and conducting terrifying night raids. In one infamous assault, Vlad and his men, disguised as Ottoman soldiers, stormed Mehmed's camp in the dead of night, aiming to assassinate the Sultan himself. They created chaos and carnage before melting back into the darkness, leaving the invincible Ottoman army shaken and unnerved. The campaign's psychological climax came as Mehmed's army approached Vlad's capital of Târgoviște. There, stretching for miles, was a grotesque forest of 20,000 impaled bodies, the captured soldiers of a previous Ottoman army, left to rot on towering stakes. The sight and stench were so horrific that even the most battle-hardened Janissaries were sickened. Mehmed himself, a man who had waded through the blood of Constantinople, was said to have stared in stunned silence, remarking with a mix of disgust and cold admiration, "How can we dispossess a man who does such things?" He had conquered an empire, but in Vlad he faced a monster of his own making. With Constantinople secured and the Byzantine ghost laid to rest, Mehmed's gaze turned westward, not towards the plains of Hungary, but to the shimmering azure expanse of the Aegean and the Adriatic. This was the domain of another ancient power, a republic of merchants and mariners, the most serene republic of Venice. What followed was not a single, decisive battle, but a grinding 16-year war of attrition, a struggle for the soul of the Mediterranean. For Mehmed, the sea was not a border, but a province to be conquered. He sought to turn the Aegean into an Ottoman lake, strangling the trade routes that were the very lifeblood of Venice. The war was a brutal saga of island sieges, coastal raids, and naval clashes. The climax, and the most horrifying chapter, was the siege of Negroponte in 1470. The Venetian colony, a jewel of its maritime empire, was considered impregnable. Mehmed arrived in person, his engineering genius once again on display as he constructed a pontoon bridge to the island, marching his army across the narrow strait. The siege was merciless. When the city finally fell, the vengeance was absolute. Venetian sources speak of a massacre so total that it shocked even the hardened sensibilities of the 15th century. The Venetian commander, Paolo Erizzo, who had been promised his head would be safe, was gruesomely sawn in half at the waist, a chilling testament to Mehmed's legalistic cruelty. This was not merely a war for territory, it was a clash of civilizations and economic philosophies. The static, land-based power of the Sultanate against the fluid, sea-based network of the Republic. Every island taken, every port blockaded, was a knot tightened around the throat of Venetian dominance, slowly bleeding the life from the Lion of St. Mark. Who was this man who could command such brilliant campaigns and commit such appalling atrocities? Within the walls of his newly constructed Topkapi Palace, a different Mehmed resided. This was not the blood-soaked conqueror, but the insatiably curious scholar, the patron of arts and sciences. He was a true Renaissance prince, albeit one forged in the crucible of Ottoman tradition. He spoke at least 6 languages fluently, including Greek, Latin, and Italian. He amassed a vast library, filled with works of history, science, and philosophy, from Ptolemy's geography to the histories of Herodotus. He would spend hours in debate with Christian scholars, Muslim theologians, and Jewish physicians, his mind a restless engine hungry for knowledge. He commissioned the Italian artist Gentile Bellini to paint his now famous portrait, a startlingly intimate depiction that defied Islamic prohibitions on portraiture. He saw himself not as a barbarian at the gates, but as the rightful heir to the Roman Empire, a unifier of East and West under his own enlightened rule. Yet, this same man was a ruthless centralizer of power, a cold and calculating autocrat. He was the Sultan who formally codified the practice of fratricide, declaring in his law code that whichever of his sons ascended to the throne should execute his brothers for the Nizam al-Alam, the good of the world order. He trusted no one, elevating slaves and converts to the highest positions of state, men whose only loyalty was to him personally, breaking the power of the old Turkish aristocracy. This was the paradox of Mehmed II. The man who could discuss the philosophy of Aristotle in the morning could, by afternoon, order the impalement of 1,000 prisoners without a flicker of emotion. He was a synthesis of light and darkness, a scholar's mind welded to a tyrant's will. Constantinople, the second Rome, was his. But for an emperor with the ambition of a Caesar, a second Rome was not enough. The ultimate prize, the symbolic heart of the world he sought to master, was the original, Rome itself. In the Ottoman imagination, Rome was the Kızıl Elma, the red apple, the final mythic city of conquest that would signify ultimate global supremacy. For the last decade of his life, this ambition consumed him. All his campaigns, all his consolidations of power, were merely a prelude to this final, epic confrontation. He saw himself as the successor of Constantine, Justinian, and Augustus. Having taken the eastern capital, it was his destiny to claim the western one. The terror in the Italian states was palpable. Popes issued crusading bulls that went largely unheeded by squabbling Christian princes. They knew Mehmed was not a distant threat, but an existential one. In 1480, the nightmare became reality. An Ottoman fleet crossed the Adriatic, bypassing the battered Venetians and the watchful Knights of Rhodes. Their target was not a remote island, but the very soil of Italy. The army, under the command of Gilded Ahmed Pasha, stormed the city of Otranto in the southern kingdom of Naples. The sack was brutal. The archbishop was sawn in half on the altar of his own cathedral. Over 800 citizens who refused to convert to Islam were beheaded on a hill outside the city, a grim episode that would become known as the Martyrdom of Otranto. For the first time since the 9th century, a Muslim army had established a permanent foothold on the Italian peninsula. Rome was less than 400 miles away. The Pope prepared to flee the city. It seemed that nothing could stop the Sultan. The red apple was finally within his grasp. The fall of Otranto sent a shockwave through Europe. The path to Rome lay open. In the spring of 1481, Mehmed II, now 50 years old but still possessing a formidable will, mustered a new grand army near Constantinople. The destination was a state secret, but everyone knew. This was it. This was the campaign that would decide the fate of Christendom. The legions of the new Caesar were on the march, but this campaign would be his last. A few days into the march, near his camp at Humiliation, the Sultan was suddenly seized by excruciating abdominal pains and a violent fever. His condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. The man who had conquered a dozen kingdoms and 200 cities, who had toppled an empire that had stood for a millennium, was now helpless in the grip of an unseen enemy. On May 3, 1481, Mehmed the Conqueror was dead. The official cause was recorded as gout and stomach colic, but the whispers began almost immediately. Poison. The timing was too perfect, too convenient for his enemies. Who was the assassin? Was it the Venetians, masters of espionage and assassination, making a final, desperate move to save themselves? Was it a court conspiracy orchestrated by his Grand Vizier, Sultan Mehmed Pasha, who was immediately lynched by the Janissaries? Or was it something more sinister, more intimate? Suspicion fell heavily upon his own son and successor Bayezid, who was known to be far more pious and less warlike than his father. Had Bayezid, fearing he would be passed over or even executed, conspired with court physicians to end the conqueror's reign? We will never know for certain. The man who wrote history in cannon fire and blood had his own final chapter written in whispers and shadows. The eagle's gaze on Rome was broken, not by a Christian army, but by a sudden, ignominious death in a military tent, leaving the world to wonder what might have been.